Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are MythVision.
Dr. Price, Kristen Whitaker Hood would like to ask, what were the religious backgrounds of the Herodians? What were some beliefs of the Idumeans?
Idumeans.
And how did the Herodian dynasty impact the origins of Christianity?
Well, they were vilified by pious Jews because Herod the Great was really an Idumean, which is the Greek version of Edomite, and they were hereditary kinsmen but enemies of Israel. And Esau was supposed to be their father. He's really a kind of a political cartoon caricature of the way Israelites viewed Edomites. And remember what Esau looked like. He had red hair. He looked pretty much like a caveman, if not Bigfoot, the way... I love this hilarious thing in Genesis where the two parents... Isaac and Rebekah have different favorite sons, and she is decided on Isaac, whereas on Jacob, whereas old blind Isaac, who was a sun god, and the reason he's blind is because he's at the end of his life and the sun's rays are getting weaker, etc. He likes the rugged outdoor type with Esau, and their mother comes up with this scheme to trick old Isaac into giving the blessing to to her favorite Isaac, and so the point is to dress him up.
Jacob? You mean her favorite?
Why can I not? Yeah.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah,
Isaac's the father, Jacob, and then Esau.
Sheesh, man.
It's okay.
I'm just like Isaac, obviously. I'm fading out. So she has him disguise himself as Esau. And how does she do that? She gets goat pelts and he uses rubber bands, I guess, to tie them onto his hands so he can go in and serve beef stew to his father. And big hunter, I've killed these critters and I know you like this stuff. And he says, oh, thanks. And he gives him the old man is suspicious, and he says, are you really my son Esau? And yeah, why do you ask? And he says, here, come closer, let me smell you, because Esau is a hunter, he's out in the wilderness, he'll smell like the outside. And I guess he does because of the animal skins. He says, here, let me feel you, my son. And he touches his wrists and his hands, and they're all furry. Well, yeah, okay, I guess you're Esau after all. What the heck? Was Esau like Larry Talbot? Was it the full moon? Was he a werewolf or something? You can tell these are mythical stories, but that's the way they viewed the Edomites. Big, powerful, stupid, and hairy, because he gets jilted or cheated out of the birthright. Why was that even a big deal? Well, because they believed that blessings and curses really had power, that you were hexing somebody if you cursed them, something bad would happen. But if you gave them a blessing, well, they would get health and prosperity and so forth. So that's why it's not a silly story in that sense. But so they were hereditary enemies, even though later in the story, Jacob and Esau meet after many years apart, and they reconcile and so on. It's a pretty neat story. But there were these troubles all through history. The Edomites or Idumeans were always kind of allies of Rome once they were on the scene, and they helped them in the conquest of Palestine. So now that's after Herod, though not by much. but they figured Herod the Great claimed to be an observant Jew. He'd sort of have to be the. He was a client king of Rome, Roman client ruling Palestine, Israel, which included Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Still, the whole thing. And so he married into the Hasmonean dynasty. Judah Maccabee started that, and his various relatives took over when he died. Well, Herod actually killed the last male heir. He was killing people left and right. He was a paranoid maniac. And but he married this woman who was some kind of a Herodian princess and claimed to be a good Jew, though he did stuff not only morally but politically that still outraged Jews. And Rome loved him, Caesar Augustus, because he was very pro-Roman and built Hellenistic Jewish cities, and where diaspora Jews would come and live there, and a lot of Gentiles. But he was paranoid, and he killed various members of his own family because he thought they were up to something and might overthrow him. And this was well known, so that Augustus said about Herod, I would rather be Herod's pig, huigos in Greek, than his son, huios. Why? Well, because being at least nominally a Jew, he's not going to eat pigs, but his sons were fair game.
Wow.
And when he was on his deathbed, Herod the Great ordered that when he died, he knew it was coming real quick, he wanted all the great Jewish leaders they could find to be gathered together into an arena and butchered when he died, because he said that way he could ensure there would be great mourning and wailing among the people. Because if it was just him dying, they'd be throwing parties. Well, when he died, they didn't follow through on that, luckily. But he was really he was a great king, but also a pretty rough one, kind of like the demiurge in Gnostic thought. I said he's not exactly evil, but it's rough justice, and we prefer a loving God. Well, so what were his beliefs and those of the Herods? They were probably, at least superficially, Hellenized Jews who gave at least lip service to the Torah, but didn't necessarily live up to it. They would have gotten along better with the Sadducees than the Pharisees. And in fact, one of the Herodians, Alexander Jannaeus, crucified thousands of Pharisees. And so they were rough customers. Now, it's been argued, I think based on some passages in Josephus, that Herod the Great thought he was the predicted Messiah and was trying to build up a cult of his own. Barbara Thiering talks about this in her books. And at first I thought, what the heck is this? She's kind of making this up. And I found, no, it really was true. He did entertain the thought. Just like Elvis, right? Elvis considered seriously whether he might be the second coming of Christ. And he finally decided, no, but I am a special envoy sent by God to spread joy. Florence Nightingale thought she was the second coming of Christ. She's, of course, a pretty good candidate for it. But these guys had these delusions of grandeur, and you really wonder if Herod the Great was like King Saul, who's depicted as a paranoid schizophrenic. They didn't have those terms, but when you look at how they're depicted, they sure were remembered that way, as irrationally murderous, and people are scheming about me and so forth. And then when he died, that unleashed a wave of messiahs. There was Athronges, the shepherd king, who kind of must have been playing it like David, who had been a shepherd and a king. And a couple of other ones that had dominion briefly of this and that group, but they were killed finally. But
so just poking in there before we move to its influence, or the Herodians' influence possibly on Christianity and theories about that. You mentioned they paid lip service to some form of Judaism, even if it was a Hellenistic version. Did these Herodians possibly also practice, or, if you will, partake in other religious, were they very synchronistic and to a point where possibly they weren't just Jews? They were like, hey, let's check out Zeus, let's check out, or were they were trying to be good Jews in their own way, but they were very liberal, if you will? I mean, how?
I think it's more the latter. At least I don't think we have evidence of syncretism.
Okay.
Though there's a really fascinating Jesus novel by, I guess I always get Robert and Frederick Grant mixed up. I think it's Robert Grant. King Jesus, which embodies a huge amount of neglected scholarship in telling the story of Jesus. And he has a fascinating account of King Herod as a syncretistic secret cultist. I don't know that Grant had any real basis for this, but it is really interesting to read. It's very much like in spirit Kazantzakis' brilliant novel The Last Temptation of Christ, even more speculative about Jesus, what he thought he was as king of the Jews, and so on. Just amazingly interesting. Kind of makes you think of the way the Gospels are written. How fictitious are they, and so on. I'd recommend anybody read both of those books. Let's see. Now, Well, I guess the main role of the Herodians as a faction in the Gospels is they're one of several groups who didn't like Jesus and plotted against him. We're told early in Mark that after a healing that was controversial, the Pharisees got together with the Herodians and decided this guy's got to go. But we never hear any aftermath of that. In fact, once you get to the Passion narratives, the Pharisees have nothing to do with it. It's the Sanhedrin dominated by the Sadducees. It's the chief priests and the elders who were Sadducees. And this is no doubt because they were in charge of the temple, and after the cleansing of the temple, they figured, again, this guy's got to go, but the Pharisees had nothing to do with that.
And then you have the Herodians and the Romans kind of, in a way, tossing Jesus back and forth, or is that's in different Gospels, but...
Yeah, in Luke, he's got Pilate trying Jesus, finding nothing amiss, and he wants to sidestep the whole mess, and so he says, well, come to think of it, if this guy's a Galilean, he'd really fall under Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great. They'd fall under his jurisdiction, and given that it's Passover, Antipas is here in Jerusalem, let's send this guy over to him and let it be his headache. And then Herod interrogates him because he'd been curious about what he'd heard of Jesus. That's what the thing in Superstar is based on. Walk across my swimming pool. And Luke says that he had wanted to see him do some miracle and so forth. And then he finds nothing worthy of condemnation in Jesus and sends him back to Pilate. And this is a somewhat clumsy attempt, I think, by Luke to use all of his sources, as ancient writers did. They kind of assumed they were, whatever their source said was probably true. They couldn't do any better, and so they didn't want to sacrifice one if there was a conflict. So they tried to say, how could they both be true? Just like harmonizers in the Gospels. So who's, in the original sources he must have had, one of them said that it was Herod Antipas that condemned Jesus to death after a kangaroo court trial, but then Mark, which Luke was also using, had Pilate do it. So how's he going to get them together? And it symbolizes what he did when it says that Jesus came back to Pilate after Herod. So the two became friends that day. They had been enemies before. We're really getting into Apocrypha there. There are various Apocrypha about Pilate and his wife and so forth. We're getting into embellishing the story, but that kind of fits with what Luke's strategy was to get them both together. And what's clumsy about it? Well, if Pilate thought that Jesus was innocent, why didn't he just let him go? What would have been the problem? Then if he sent him to Herod, and Herod also said, not guilty, why does Pilate go on with it? What's the point? It's just crammed together in a nonsensical way. So that really vanishes. The Gospel of Peter tries to harmonize them too, but it's just, in fact, I could go on and on about what this Herodian source must have said, but I won't go off on a tangent on that one.
So I guess into that, because we could go on and on, I'm sure, with some of this stuff, is how did the Herodian dynasty impact the origins of Christianity? Maybe we can delve into that.
Yeah, that's quickly said, actually. The important thing there would be Robert Eisenman's argument that Paul was a Herodian. Because if he actually wrote Romans 16, where he says at the end of the epistle, say hello to this one and that one, and a whole list of people, he's got an Antipas in there, I believe, and Herodian, and others where the names are clearly from the family of Herod, the very big family of Herod. And then there's Paul's friendly relations with the Romans. I mean, he almost gets himself killed, as one of the Herodian monarchs says. You know, it's a pity if this guy hadn't made the appeal to Caesar. He could just walk out scot-free. So Paul seems, Eisenman says, to have had Herodian connections and family connections probably with him. And that might imply that that might have something to do with the fact that Pauline Christianity is so different from that of the Gospels. It implies vaguely some sort of syncretism. Were the Herodians more open to these foreign influences? After all, one of their circle was Simon Magus, according to Josephus. And there's an interesting bit of Gnosticism, syncretism. So it's just a few dots that only speculation can connect, but depending on how Herodian Paul was, and how different he was from the Jerusalem Christians, it might have had quite a bit to do with the shape, the more mystery religion character of early Christianity.
That makes me think of, and I've heard this said from Dr. Luther. He mentioned something about the Herodian Temple, or the Herodian, I don't know if it was the temple, but where Herod was staying is right there at the Qumran situation, where the Qumran sects were located. They were very close to one another.
Right.
Right. And so it makes you kind of wonder, with Robert Eisenman's work and others, that would suggest that there is some type of language used, borrowed by Paul from the Dead Sea Scroll sect, except it appears, if one were to look at some of this language, he's not necessarily implying the Romans are in any way, shape, or form bad. It's the opposite. So kind of makes you wonder, was there possibly a Herodian tie-in here where, you know, the Herodians and the Qumran sect were fine until crap hits the fan, and now it's like, we got to find out what side we're on, just throwing it out there as a total speculative idea, and that the Pauline epistles are Herodian in a sense that they're not on these guys' side. They're actually taking a stand on the opposite spectrum. Don't know if that has anything there, maybe, but
well, The Dead Sea Scrolls, as Eisenman points out, speaks of the mocker or the spouter of lies, among whose transgressions was to offer a simplified version of Judaism to the Gentiles, the simple ones of Ephraim, as they called them. Everything is in code, so it's very difficult to tell who's what in the scrolls. But that would kind of favor the what would you call it? There's some Greek term of the openness toward Hellenism of the Herodian house. But all of this begs questions of who actually wrote what and who is intended in the Dead Sea Scrolls references and so on. So it gets even more messy and speculative, but there are plausible connections that Eisenman makes. I mean, I regard him as one of the greatest biblical scholars of our age.
Join our Patreon